Welcome, online viewers. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for having generously sponsored this series, and also thank Tony Oates and the Drill Hall Gallery for having invited me to give this series of lectures. On the screen, some of the new conveniences that appeared in the early 20th century. There were many more than these, of course. There were electricity grids and power stations. There was electricity in the home. There was electric lighting in the streets, telegraphs and radio, telephones, electrocardiograms, radiography, new panaceas, vaccines, aspirins, vitamins, anti-tetanus serum, submarines, zeppelins, machine guns, and TNT explosives. And 19th century science was behind it all. Technology was the outcome of applied science, but behind the applied science was the pure science practiced by men and women who were interested in understanding the laws that governed natural forces and matter. Their curiosity, which they shared with speculative thinkers from ancient times as well, from the beginning of science as we know it, was focused on the fact that the laws of nature are hidden. Albert Einstein, when he explained his youthful interest in science, ascribed it to his conviction that, quote, something deeply hidden had to be behind things. Whether advertently or not, Einstein was paraphrasing the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Heraclitus is thought to have lived between the 6th and 5th century BC. He famously wrote that nature was in a state of flux, an intuition that seems to chime in with modern science. He also observed that nature likes to hide itself, which was the same as Einstein's intuition that something deeply hidden had to be behind things. This predilection for searching through, searching beyond, discounting the superficially obvious, had, of course, striking parallels in developments in the visual arts during the 50 years between 1867 and 1915, as well as before and after that period. The new nature, as it was understood in the modern era, is fundamentally different from conceptions that held sway in the past, during the Renaissance, for instance. Conventions of visual representation of that time portrayed a worldview consistent with what was commonly assumed. Space was uniform, it was continuous and homogeneous. It could be measured and organized through geometry. The ideas of Euclid, Euclidean geometry, held sway for some 2,500 years in Western civilization. The ideas of Aristotle and Plato likewise seemed perennial. And then, of course, the Judeo-Christian heritage, still flickering, albeit quite weakly, in Turner's painting, the full title of which is Light and Color, Goethe's Theory, in brackets, the morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis. Turner splices biblical and topical scientific references together, the painting alludes to Goethe's critique of Newton's theory of optics, to Newton's account of the refraction of light. But I think most important of all, we need to acknowledge Turner's huge, decisive, momentous differences from the prior classical representations of time, space, and light. Comparable to Heraclitus, all is flux, and the indistinctness and blurring and flickering effects that Turner exploits convey to us that the scene is run through and through by time. And most astonishingly of all, time and space don't appear to be separate phenomena. And yet, even more clairvoyant and visionary, everything seems to be made of the same substance. Everything is made out of light, of the same whirling, swirling light energy that pervades everything. The new worldview, the new science, which makes obsolete the old dispensation. That's the gist of this painting here. A famous warship, a relic of the Battle of Trafalgar, is being towed away to be broken up, led by a steam-powered tugboat. The technology of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, has made the earlier technology redundant, and this painting is a sort of requiem to the pre-industrial age. Steam, the characteristic byproduct of the new technology, of the science of thermodynamics, becomes in a very real sense a harbinger, not only of the industrial age, but of modernity itself. If you look at the lineage in modern art from Turner to Whistler and the Impressionists, to the smoky ambience affected by analytic cubist paintings, to the columns of smoke in Leger that we looked at in the last lecture, this is amply borne out. Turner's contemporary John Constable referred to Turner as the painter of tinted steam. How perfectly uncontrived and unpretentious this rapport is between a painter and contemporary science. One justification for singling out Turner as a forerunner, or even as the forerunner of modern art, and valuing him as a sort of companion of the route in the long march of modern science, is that modern science stages a thoroughgoing overturning of the classical concepts of space, time, and light, which became the upshot of Einstein's special theory of relativity. And those very categories of space, time, and light are conspicuously transformed in the development of modern art, of course. Robert Brown was a Scottish botanist who'd accompanied Matthew Flinders during Flinders' voyage circumnavigating the Australian continent in 1802 to 1803. One day in 1827, Robert Brown was examining grains of pollen in a drop of water through a powerful microscope. The pollen grains appeared to be in a state of constant agitation. When Brown returned later, and then later still, their movement was the same as before. What was giving them the jitters? The inference that they were being buffeted by invisible atoms or molecules began to gain credence. Proof that atoms and molecules actually existed was little by little extrapolated from Robert Brown's observations, culminating in Einstein's famous breakthrough paper on Brownian motion, published in 1905. The striking fact here is that Brownian motion remained an unanswered question for so long. The disaggregation of matter, the identification of jiggling particles as the basis of all phenomena, was, strange to say, an intuition that had seized hold of modern painters concurrently with the scientists. In several previous lectures, we've identified the tush, the spot, the blotch or patch, as a carrier of profound implications in modern art. From the time of Corot in the 1820s, more or less contemporaneous with the discovery of Brownian motion, through Manet Impressionism, Divisionism, Cézanne, Fauvism, etc., to the advent of Kandinsky's abstract painting. There's a wonderful account of the disaggregation and atomization of naturalistic appearances in painting, with or accompanied by, resulting from the ascendancy of the tush. And this account was written by the art historian Pierre Schneider in his wonderful monograph on Matisse. This is what he wrote. Even in canvases where colour did not yet blaze openly, the stroke quivered, simmered, darted in all directions, spilled over the outlines of forms, settled, scattered itself, whirled, melted, and abruptly broke off. Abandoned to the maenads of colour, the realistic image was torn to tatters. We do need to remind ourselves once again that this phenomenon took place amid the gigantic industry of academic art, and that academic artists clung tenaciously to the paradigms that were being questioned, that were being shaken, or had already been made obsolete by scientists and philosophers. Recognizing the inauthenticity of the academicians, and conversely, the authenticity of an artist like Seurat, is to acknowledge that Seurat is alert and alive to new ways of thinking, and what he portrays is, in effect, the new nature, where fundamental ideas of time, space, and light are being radically reconceived. In this painting, Seurat portrays a fairly unprepossessing, almost deserted provincial harbourside. Seurat is quite dogmatically anti-picturesque. The more banal the motif, the better, it would seem. The nearer we approach it, the more the image dissolves before our eyes. The harsh light bathing the scene loses its consistency in close-up. A dense swarm of tiny particles that maintain their separateness, that are more or less uniform, that seem to have no weight or mass, they're all thronging together. The image we saw from a distance, compared to what we see in close-up, comes to seem completely insubstantial and illusory. You'll notice also that Seurat treats in an identical manner occupied and empty space, solid and void, near and far, substance and shadow. The schism in our perception arises from changes of scale. What we apprehend at, let's call it human scale, is the picture, with its depth of field, its naturalistic proportions, the distinctness of where one thing ends and another begins, the weather conditions, and the local colors of trousers, bricks, timber, etc. But as Seurat demonstrates to us, and as scientists were making quite alarmingly evident at the same time, the nature we know, or the nature we think we know, doesn't behave in the same way on the scale of the very small or on the scale of the very large. Maurice Denis, the Nabi painter and theorist, made a very pertinent but interestingly wrong-headed observation. He said, "It is by concentrating all their efforts on the representation of light that modern art was able to turn its back on nature," unquote. Very, very true, and very, very false at one at the same time. Maurice Denis was a devout, and one would have to say doctrinaire, Catholic. For him, man was made in God's image, and nature was something else. It was apart and alienable from the human essence. Nature was the opposite of intellect and spirit. As a well-educated Frenchman, Maurice Denis would have been familiar with Descartes' ideas. He would have known about Descartes' belief that the mental world in here of our consciousness was split off from the objective world out there. Nature was categorically out there, not in here. Nonetheless, we can rephrase Maurice Denis' statement as follows. It is by concentrating all their efforts on the representation of light that modern art was able to turn its back on untenable and obsolete conventions of representation, and could thus reconceive art's rapport with nature and with our human feelings, intuitions, and knowledge in regard to nature or what nature might be. As if to vindicate modern artists in this preoccupation with light and the vital role this played in the evolution towards non-objective painting, there was something analogous happening in parallel in the world of science. The great Scottish Physicist and mathematician James Clerk Maxwell published the summary of his experiments with electromagnetism in 1865 in a paper entitled A Dynamical Theory of the Electromagnetic Field. In it, he proposed that light and electric and magnetic waves were different aspects of the same phenomenon, coinciding in a weird and unaccountable way with Clerk Maxwell's expose of electromagnetic fields. There was a perceptible shift in the conventions of landscape painting, an analogous preoccupation with fields of visual energy, fields of radiance, as was noted in lecture number 3 of this series. A late but very characteristic example of that is given by Monet's treatment of the view from his hotel room in Leicester Square in London. Monet's friend, James Whistler, was ailing and obviously dying at the time, and this would have been Monet's valediction and tribute to Whistler's most notorious and execrated paintings, the Nocturnes. There's nothing in these paintings which makes any sense if it is isolated from its context. What we're seeing is categorically a non-objective world. It is a phantasmagoria of light, where there are no autonomous parts, no objects, no things. Monet conveys the vision of a whole which is a field conditioning everything within its purview. The phenomenal world, which he shows us, is woven out of a flux of time, space, and light. Abandoned to the maenads of color, the realistic image was torn to tatters, Pierre Schneider wrote. But it was torn to tatters by scientists as well. The constructs of space, time, and light were thoroughly taken apart by 19th century scientists and revised again by Albert Einstein in his 1905 special theory of relativity. In his book about art and physics, Leonard Schlein summarized the upshot of Einstein's revolutionary propositions. The quintessence is light itself. Both the fields of quantum mechanics and relativity arose out of two unresolved questions about the nature of light. Furthermore, Einstein discovered that the speed of light was an invariant and immutable number. In some strange way, light is the link connecting space, time, energy, and matter. Light is the link connecting space, time, energy, and matter. For some unaccountable reason, some artists had intuited as much. A detail of Monet's water lily murals in the Orangerie in Paris, painted between the 1910s up until the time of his death in the 1920s. As I've tried to convey, Radical shifts in scientific understanding and in philosophy, in literature, and visual representation have tended to move in unison. How this actually happens is anybody's guess, but happen it does. Changes seem to occur in parallel, more or less simultaneously, altering the parameters of what it is possible to think and how it is possible to think, recalibrated across an entire culture. John Atkins Richardson, in his book Modern Art and Scientific Thought, noted, "The fascinating thing about the modern art that has attained its interest for us is that it was so often accompanied into existence by scientific philosophical developments, which are very nearly its counterparts in stature as well as disposition. Such similitude is of more than incidental interest, because it points up so clearly the complex interactions between all intellectually conceived phenomena within the ongoing life of the culture. A wise critic understands that everything, without exception, is symptomatic of certain aspects of the milieu in which it happens." Unquote. We may like to consider this as the proposal for a field theory or a quantum theory of culture, acknowledging that there is a speculative imagination and a creative agency permeating the space-time of our collective existence, which some are able to intuit, some would be more receptive to, and which some would affect to a greater degree than others. Earlier we noted that Turner's painting, with a long title, referred explicitly to Goethe's theory of color. When Goethe published his theory of color, there were scientists who rounded in on him as an interloper, attacking his presumption that he had something relevant to say in regard to Newton's theory of color. Poets, the scientists said, dealt with the sensuous and affective aspects of life. They dealt with human truths, not scientific ones. In stark contrast to poets, scientists were engaged with fundamental aspects of reality that aren't accessible to the senses, seeking to uncover objective laws which are fundamental to the universe. How much this dichotomy would have actually widened in the early 20th century. Physics had then become the predominant strand of modern science, having grown increasingly abstract, describing natural phenomena in mathematical terms, to the point that maths took over completely. The equations of modern physics posited a world that was impossible to visualize. And yet, no less an authority than Albert Einstein himself insisted on the commonality between artists and scientists, and made a very beautiful and humbling declaration that put their aspirations on one and the same level. I quote, "The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Sometime towards the middle of the 20th century, in the popular imagination, Einstein was seen as the incarnation of modern science, just as Picasso was seen as the incarnation of modern art. What did the one have to do with the other? Were there any grounds for comparison of their respective achievements? Leonard Shlain put this question in the preface to his book about art and physics, wondering if there is a connection between the inscrutability of modern art and the impenetrability of the new physics. It's a very bad question, of course, and his book serves as a corrective to the assumption that modern art is inscrutable and the new physics impenetrable, countering any disbelief about their possible relationship. Making forced comparisons between Einstein and Picasso, making one a reflection of the other, equating cubism with quantum mechanics, has proven a colossal stumbling block to our understanding of either. Picasso was so offended by comparisons of this sort that in 1923 he lashed out, defending his and Braque's achievement from the mystifications that had become increasingly prevalent. Here's what he said: "Mathematics, trigonometry, chemistry, psychoanalysis, music, and whatnot have been related to cubism to give it an easier interpretation. All this has been pure literature, not to say nonsense, which has only succeeded in blinding people with theories." One thing sticks out here. There's no mention of Einstein, no mention of physics, nor any physicists. The year is 1923, and it was only 1 year earlier, in 1922, that Einstein won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and when his name became well known outside of the very restricted circle of his peers. Picasso blew his top because of the persistence of misleading comparisons, not so much with science, but with, first of all, mathematics and trigonometry. The likeliest cause of his annoyance was a tenacious legend spread by some of Picasso's boosters, notably André Salmon, as well as by some of his nastiest detractors, to the effect that a mathematician by the name of Maurice Princet had played a significant role in the invention of cubism, and may indeed have been a prime mover of this revolution in pictorial form. In fact, if you look up Maurice Princet in Wikipedia, you'll find him called the mathematician of cubism. Maurice Princet moved among the bohemian crowd of Montmartre in the 1900s. His greatest claim to fame, or the greatest claim made on his behalf, is that he's said to have shown, or to have given, Picasso a book explaining four-dimensional geometry, that is to say, post-Euclidean geometry, with accompanying diagrams, one of which is on the screen. Maurice Princet led a long life. He died at the age of 98 in 1973, the same year as Picasso, and had ample time to fuel the legend of his show and tell to Cubist painters. Indeed, those claims have given longevity, if not immortality, to his reputation. There's the entry in Wikipedia I mentioned, diverse articles in various languages, at least one book devoted entirely to him, and a large presence in Linda Dalrymple Henderson's blockbuster study of modern art, which I'll refer to presently. All of this celebrity, notwithstanding Picasso's protestation that any such influence on the development of Cubism was irrelevant and nonsensical. Linda Dalrymple Henderson is an American art historian. Her book on the fourth dimension runs to more than 700 pages, containing much valuable information relating to parallel developments in mathematics and theoretical science and the visual arts. The fourth dimension, as her book presents it, is first of all solemnly theorized by an American mathematician, Charles Howard Hinton, and is then taken up by other mathematicians and by physicists. The fourth dimension then comes to be claimed by theosophists, psychics, a motley crew of pseudoscientists, smart Alecs, and dilettantes. The fourth dimension is an idea bandied about by visual artists and writers. Lots of visual artists, lots of writers. Some latch onto it eagerly, some latch onto it anxiously. For some, it is a burning question. For others, it is a way of deflecting questions. In other words, a faddish mystification. Linda Dalrymple Henderson is somehow able to deal even-handedly and in good faith with one and all, leaving, it would seem, no stone unturned, all and any mention of the fourth dimension by an artist or writer, or in a commentary about an artist or writer, becomes grist for the author's relentless and omnivorous incorporation. The aim of this exceptionally ambitious, and you would be forced to admit, exceptionally courageous book is to make the fourth dimension the story of modern art. As such, it may or may not convince a skeptical reader. I should add, as an aside, that the arguments to associate Picasso's painting on the right with the diagrams on the left I find preposterous, and I should confess as well that I'm not a fan of Picasso's famous Cubist portraits, not of any of them. This one in particular I find unresolved, muddled, and the word I'm looking for would be something like stilted, forced, contrived, but that's an aside. It's beside the point, really. There's a valuable realization that this book does convey to us very well. It is that new ideas, including, of course, scientific discoveries, can have a powerful impact on a culture merely through the catchphrases and jargon spread by means of the publicity, surrounding a scientific breakthrough. To the scientific community, of course, any general adoption of those catchphrases and jargon will seem completely opportunistic and unserious. Nonetheless, in certain times, in certain places and circumstances, these ideas can be contagious. They may indeed inaugurate major changes in artistic practice, although to say that they inaugurate anything may be a misnomer, overstating how such things actually happen. They might serve as catalysts. They might serve to encourage and legitimize departures from the traditional parameters of a tottering and collapsing worldview, as was surely the case here. We'll take as an example the Russian painter Mikhail Larionov. It's interesting to note that Larionov and his partner Natalia Goncharova were both included in Roger Fry's second post-impressionist exhibition in London in 1912. Also, both of them had been organizers and had been a mainstay of avant-garde exhibitions held in Moscow from 1906 onwards, and that they were co-founders of the important Jack of Diamonds exhibitions in Russia, which we mentioned in the last lecture. Larionov, like so many others of his generation, became aware of avant-garde painting from Impressionism onwards, not just as a harbinger of light and color, but as a harbinger of dissolution and disintegration. Cézanne, the so-called father of modern painting, they recognized as a forerunner because, for them, he personified the crisis afflicting naturalistic painting, and perhaps representation itself, causing the means of representation to warp, to fracture, to falter, to fumble, to fall apart. Cézanne became a prototype and role model for modernist painters subsequently because of his powerful synthetic intelligence. Through this, he was able to reimpose coherence and cogency to restore the logic of organized sensations. That was Cézanne's own phrase. The more up-to-date modernist movements Larionov would have been familiar with, Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism, Orphism, which was the abstraction of Delaunay, Kupka, and others, would all have endorsed, would all have amplified and exaggerated a general sense of a breakdown, of a crack-up of representational conventions. But it's important to note that by far the biggest influence on his approach came from Cubism. The surface of things, the skin of the world, any stable construct of time, space, and light barely pertains, or is deliberately portrayed by the artist as if it no longer pertained. This painting's title is Glass. After the initial disorientation, you start to notice the shape of a brown bottle and a green decanter pouring green liquid into a large wine glass, maybe watering down the red wine in the glass. And then there are 5 tumblers, maybe 6. The theme or pretext of transparency is used to create an effect of immateriality and spatial indeterminacy, with clashing, intersecting shafts of light energy. That is what one assumes they are, but also it's possible to identify them as splinters of broken glass. As was the case with Cézanne and with all the best Cézannians, as a general rule, Larionov's synthetic abilities, his artistry, if you will, triumphs over the apparent shambles of bad drawing, garbled proportion, spatial incoherence, and shoddy-looking technique. In the last analysis, it's a very good painting. And what has happened, quite obviously, is that the busy foreground of dynamic vectors and clustering planes completely upstages the still life motif. Even more paradoxically, the pretext of translucency and omnipresent pale light is conveyed through very thin paint, very filmy, very rubbed back. And so the ostensible transparency and immateriality of the motif yields to an awareness of the gritty materiality of the painted surface. From this painting called Glass, Larionov developed an idiom that could make his paintings stand out in the very competitive international milieu he and Natalia Goncharova moved in. Larionov and Goncharova were another one of those artist couples, joined at the hip, it would seem, like the Delaunay's, like Picasso and Braque, like Kandinsky and Gabriela Munter. Initially, Larionov wanted to call this idiom, this new brand of modernist painting he had devised, Luchism or Lukism, which I assume means lightism, but then opted for the brand name of Rayonism, which proved to be quite an effective choice. The debut exhibition of Rayonism took place in Paul Guillaume's brand new gallery in Paris in 1913, where it created quite a stir. This painting may or may not have been in the show. Larionov and Goncharova falsified the dating of some of their works. This one has an inscribed date of 1910, though historians have put it back by 3 or 4 years. It's titled Nocturne, and it's very evocative. You can imagine sparks in a steel foundry, or a plunging view down from a skyscraper building to a brightly lit street down below with lots of traffic, or the representation of a gust of wind, or atoms in a particle collider. It's all these things and none of them. Giving a painting the title of Nocturne makes a specific reference to Whistler's night paintings, and it's revealing to put them side by side and realize what Larionov must have intended in making this connection. Whistler, like Larionov, pulverizes and annihilates an image, but the pulverization and annihilation becomes an image in its own right, and this becomes a defining feature of Larionov's brand of non-objective painting. Rayonism is the painting of the shocks and couplings of the rays between objects and the dramatic representation of the battle between the emanations from all things. So there is an allusion to electromagnetism, to force fields, to the behavior of immaterial energies, and of course, wait for it, to the fourth dimension. All of these are enthusiastically accepted as the new nature that science has revealed to the modern artist. Goncharova, too, is a rayonist, and on the left a blue, green, black and white smash-up, which she associates with the idea of a forest and a small but beautifully choreographed and wonderfully vivacious little collision on the right. Rayonism is about energy, maximal energy, the latent energy hidden in matter. Matter in this case being oil paint. Larionov and Goncharova apply themselves to making this energy burst out from its substance and explode into our consciousness. The precedent they had set for the re-emergence of non-objective painting in America post-World War II isn't sufficiently recognized, so I'd like to conclude by considering two of the leading lights of New York painting, Jackson Pollock and Barnett Newman, in regard to some of the themes we've covered, most particularly the new nature revealed by physics early in the 20th century. In 1946, when Jackson Pollock was asked why he didn't paint from nature, he replied in a huff, "I am nature." So what was he implying? What was he assuming by answering in that way? Very close to this time, Barnett Newman, who'd not yet found himself as the painter we know, wrote a justification of his own paintings, not so good at the time, and of other New York artists with whom he felt an affinity, Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko among them. Newman wrote that their work consisted of formulas which are symbols that evoke, in a stenographic fashion, the idea complex that is Einstein's version of the cosmos, unquote. How much or how little Newman knew of what he was talking about is anyone's guess, and we may be prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt or not. But clearly, he anticipated the hard questions and inevitable rebuttals. He and his contemporaries were dealing with symbols, not the physicist's symbols, but the artist's made-up symbols. And they're stenographic, that is to say, they're like shorthand, an abstracted transposition, a cryptic equivalence. And so how might this assertion intersect with Jackson Pollock's declaration, "I am nature," and with the non-objective paintings he began making in the 1940s and early 1950s? It seems to imply that he can project and direct through his body the impulses and energies of his inner being, bypassing the mediation by imagery. The new nature, revealed by science, consists of fields, particles, and waves. The phenomenal world that we apprehend through our senses is the outcome of energy made visible, which in fact is the title of a biography of Pollock that came out in 1972. The vision of the cosmos and the idea complex Newman ascribed to Einstein evokes a non-objective world, a world without objects, whose counterpart was, of course, non-objective painting. And Jackson Pollock's identification with nature, his rebuttal of any split between a purely mental world of individual consciousness in here and an objective world out there, finds sympathy and endorsement even from scientists, from Werner Heisenberg, for instance. Heisenberg said, "The common division of the world into subject and object, inner world and outer world, body and soul, is no longer adequate." I think that may be a good point to leave off. Thank you for your interest. See you again.